repeat some of the things that Roseanne shared with you. My name is Matt Sheehan. I'm the Director of Library Services at Goodwin University. And, this session is about overcoming what's unfortunately common in most universities and colleges. And that is, how can we grow the collection when valuable resources and faculty insight are disrupted? And I have a few slides to guide today's session, but basically, we're going to take a look at how web scraping can put you back into the driver's seat when making collection development decisions. And I'm going to use my experience of overseeing collections and faculty communications at Albertus Magnus College as a focus point. And obviously, to be fully transparent, I'm no longer with Albertus Magnus College. It's a great institution. I worked there for about 10 years. Just letting you know in case you try to connect afterwards, you're not going to find me in New Haven, Connecticut. And my objectives today, because, we can't escape without a few objectives, even if we're the last session for the day, is to really just inspire curiosity and hopefully build some confidence to learn web scraping on your own. Because, I was communicating with Roseanne over the last few days over email, and she really said it best when she was describing my session as really using technology to solve a very human issue. And that human issue is really, what happens when there's a breakdown in communication, and how can we as librarians, reclaim some of the lost agency when making informed, data-driven decisions. And there's going to be a little bit of code today and a very gentle introduction to Python, which is a scripting language for web scraping. But my goal isn't really to throw a lot of code at you, then sign off for the day. I like to joke by saying that I would like to be invited to next year's conference. So, I'm going to be very intentional in today's session, and I'm going to be thorough, but also thoughtful when I'm presenting um, a lot of this information to you, because like Roseanne said, it is very technical, but there's maybe a simplified way of unpacking these technical concepts. So let's get started. And, we're going to get going with a little bit of scene setting. And, I do admit maybe it's not a very diplomatic start to the session by showing a library being torn asunder. But that's where we are, and really what brought us here. Well, I know some of these factors, they're not going to be too surprising. And, I think a lot of people here will probably agree with me when I share that, what I'm saying today probably isn't going to be too new, especially if you have a background in collection development. We have our usual barriers facing collection development. There's pressure from senior leadership to remove print items for space optimization. And usually when they say space optimization, they're looking for additional office space for faculty, or they're looking for additional classroom space. We are faced with reduced budgets, or stagnant budgets that are not increasing by, the hopeful 5%, that will at least cover some of the rising costs due to inflation. And then maybe more specific to research institutions, we're seeing a shrinking number of subject specialists in favor of maybe information literacy generalists. And so there's been less of a priority in expertise and more of a priority in things like student engagement. And that's not a bad thing. But, it's going to impact how much funding we have available for doing things like building the collection or maintaining the collection, right? Because then the priority given to collection development is brought down a couple of pegs. And where has this led us as, librarians with a background in collection development? Well, Many institutions have been growing their dependence on faculty to make decisions regarding adding and removing items. This relationship has been filling the void caused by that same decrease in subject specialty. We're also seeing a growing dependence on what's known as demand-driven acquisitions and evidence-based acquisition agreements. Because if we don't know exactly, what to purchase, well, we're better off claiming everything, even though access is then discontinued at the end of the fiscal year, right? And that's really the benefit of those DDA and EBA agreements. You get access to everything, an entire corpus, if you can afford that upfront deposit. But by the end of the fiscal year, you're going to lose access to the majority of those ebooks. And if your users are used to accessing specific titles that might not be accessible within, 11 or 12 months, that might cause some issues or some friction there. And, these acquisition agreements and faculty partnerships, they're great. I'm definitely not opposed to them, but we have to take a hard look at, what happens when administrative support breaks down, leading to a decline in effective faculty communication. And unfortunately, this was a growing issue at Albertus Magnus College, and it was really impacting or hurting our ability to maintain our collection, specifically in support of one of our only research programs, and that's the art therapy program. And, it wasn't as if we weren't trying to make a difference or make, inroads with faculty members, because in a period of 2 years, we created an interactive collections newsletter that was sent out to faculty maybe once every 3 months. We launched new faculty web pages on the library's website. We even redesigned the entire library website to, in an effort to surface um, information that faculty members might be more attentive to. And we also made changes to the library's physical space to accommodate different study habits. So we knew that senior leadership had a few ideas to re-optimize space, and we wanted to kind of get ahead of that and, take the initiative and make some of those changes to the space ourselves. We also, made sure to invite faculty members in if they wanted to host office hours with students. We wanted to make sure that librarians were there to support them every step of the way. And to that same tune, we took leadership on faculty onboarding. So we were very instrumental with onboarding new faculty members coming to the college in an effort to kind of reconnect and rebuild some of those partnerships. But the reality is, and probably many of you today will agree with me, is that there's this fragility in the partnerships librarians create with faculty. And sometimes all it takes is a change in senior leadership or maybe the retirement of a department chair to really throw things off. And these are normal occurrences. But these changes created a disconnect between the library and faculty at the college. And unfortunately, we weren't really able to repair that. And so we thought, you know, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could regain, again, some independence from an over-reliance on faculty input and expensive acquisition models? What if we could gain enough insight into what books to purchase, and then we could use that data to try to reconnect with faculty? So basically, we wanted to know if it's possible to learn what the experts, those art therapy authors themselves, what references they are using when they publish. If a specific book or journal is referenced 20, 30 or more times, then maybe that's something we should have in our own collection. And this is what brought me to the idea of web scraping. Now, you might have heard of web scraping before, this term before, and if you have heard of it before, chances are pretty high that you don't have a favorable view of it because, constantly in the news, we're seeing how Those large language models are web scraping vast amounts of information, oftentimes illegally without permission, and then, breaches in data and privacy. But all it is, at the very basic level, is the process of extracting text, images, and other data from a website into a database or other platform for analysis. And this is usually done using a Python script or Python coding and specific Python libraries called Beautiful Soup or Selenium. And I also want to share with everyone today that, this slide is maybe one of the three technical slides I have for you today. So please don't feel overwhelmed. Please don't leave just yet. Don't go. I promise it gets a little bit better and easier from here. Because again, my objective isn't really to turn everyone into a coder overnight. I really want to just focus on building some curiosity so that you feel a little bit maybe empowered to pick up a new skill on your own. And honestly, like most technical concepts, it can be explained more simply. And really, what better way of doing this than to kind of bring us back to childhood, right? So I'm imagining like tire swings and life before the war with Iran, all of the good things. But jokes aside, who doesn't remember I Spy? Web scraping is kind of like this. So you're locating specific items from a source. In this example, it's finding items in a page of I Spy, but in typical everyday examples, it's finding specific items on a web page. And those items, like what I have circled here or in that square image, like trophy and stereo, etc. I see some seashells in there. All of those items are stored in what's known as a list. And you see a list on the left-hand side. You could think of a list as, technically speaking, it's a variable. You could name it anything you want, and it's holding all of those items. And because all of those items are text data, they are words, we wrap the words in quotation marks. So you see trophy there wrapped in quotation marks, stereo wrapped in quotation marks, etc., etc. And the correct syntax for a list is to wrap it with those square brackets. And, the cool thing with web scraping is that we could get very specific on exactly what to capture. So instead of copying everything on the bottom shelf, we could instruct the code to grab, for instance, only the trophies. And web scraping's value is exactly this. Its ability to extract data from an otherwise very crowded and disorganized source. But thankfully, websites are not fully like I Spy books. Then again, I've come across quite a few very disorganized websites. But thankfully, the websites that librarians typically visit, like publishers' websites, vendor websites, um, usual like academic websites, they're very well structured with everything coded in easy to parse languages like HTML and CSS. So this image here, this is taken from higheredjobs.com. We see the website on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, we see a lot of that corresponding code in HTML. Now, if you're unfamiliar with HTML, try to think of it as the words you see on the web page. So on the left, again, we see the job title, its location, and then on the right in the code itself, maybe I could use my cursor to help us out. We see that same text over here. So that's HTML in a nutshell. CSS, on the other hand, is all about the styling of a web page. Think of colors, think of structure. And then there's one more language that we're not really going to touch upon today, and that's JavaScript. JavaScript is really the functionality in a website. So what happens when you click on a button? What happens when you hover over an item? Does a specific image change as you scroll down the page? That's all going to be in JavaScript. And every page has those elements. So again, previously we saw library job postings from higheredjobs.com. This is if you're feeling thirsty, it's a web page from Starbucks about their new iced drinks. Absolutely delicious, I know, but same concept. You have the web page on the left, and then the code that describes that website on the right. And lastly, this is a page from Barnes& and Noble because this is a library presentation, so I had to have books somewhere in here. The same concept. You see the content from the website on the left and all of the HTML and CSS on the right-hand side. And, really, so what? So, what does all of this mean? And why am I spending a lot of this time and just kind of laying the groundwork for us today? Well, theoretically, and, I've done a lot of this in the past, a web scraping code can do things like analyze job changes and position titles from higheredjobs.com. It could list and export all five-star reviewed books published in the last 5 years. So if you're leading like a book club and you would like an Excel spreadsheet of everything published and reviewed, you could do that using web scraping. You can collect nutrition information about drinks, and then you could store that information in a database. And yes, to the point of today's session, you can even extract bibliographic information in web articles. And that's the really cool thing. And again, to Roseanne's earlier point, this is about using technology to overcome a very human issue. And knowing this, knowing that our online journal articles are coded the same way as any other web page gave me an idea. And here's the project scope. I'll just put it all on the screen for us to read. I take a much needed sip of water. But here's the idea. So I wanted to create a Python script. And again, a script is just another word for code to extract citation data from two journals published by Taylor and Francis, Art Therapy and the Canadian Journal of Art Therapy. So I wanted to grab that data, aggregate it to understand citation patterns. And while we're here, let's do the same thing for article keywords and abstracts. And, really, why do I want to do that? What's the value? The value is, just knowing what art therapy authors themselves are citing, what references the experts themselves are using. That's going to take pressure off the need for faculty feedback on collection development decisions. And if we have an exact list of books that are actually used, not just purchased, because it's relatively easy for libraries to get a list of books that have been purchased by 500 or more libraries, but I wasn't really interested in that, dynamic. And actually knowing that 500 or 1,000 other libraries own a book in art therapy is a good reason for us to probably not purchase that book because we could easily borrow it on interlibrary loan. We were more interested in understanding what authors themselves were using when they're publishing in these two journals. And then I could use that data to create a strong argument to secure more funding, right? Because now we have a list of books that we know are valuable. That creates a strong argument that we could bring to senior leadership to secure more funding for the collections. Okay, so can we do this technically? Yes. So the image on the left is from, it's taken from the Art Therapy Journal, published by Taylor and Francis from, on Taylor and Francis's website. You could inspect the page which you can do on really any web page just by right-clicking any website. So, maybe after the session or sometime in the future, go to any of your favorite website, right-click on the page, and then choose Inspect. When you choose Inspect, you're going to see this dialog box appear that's very similar to what you see on the right-hand side. And then when I did this on Taylor and Francis's webpage, what happened was, it really demonstrated a very easy structure for us to eventually web scrape. So the exact citation information, that's stored under the CSS class. You can see the name right here, citation source book italicized, and all citation data. So all of the books and journal articles referenced in this one article, that's coded under the class called references numeric ordered list. And then you could see exactly how the title is being mapped to the HTML code. So you could see what I underlined over here, and then how it actually appears on the back end. And again, at this point, we're not doing web scraping. We're just kind of doing a lot of the pre-work that will help me determine whether or not it's viable to web scrape this website. So can we do this? Like technically, yes, we can. But, can we do this really? Meaning, can we web scrape Taylor and Francis's website ethically and responsibly? Yeah, I thought we could. Um, and this is a fun thing to do on any web page. You could just type in the URL. So here I have taylorandfrancis.com. And then if you add a backslash robots.txt, you know, it's going to list any restrictions that website, that company has against web scraping, whether they allow it or disallow it, whether they only allow it on specific pages. It gets pretty thorough. And I didn't see any restrictions. Oops. I didn't see any restrictions um, by thinking that I could possibly web scrape Taylor and Francis's website. But, if there's anything you take away from today's session, it's always better to ask than to seek forgiveness later. And after Taylor and Francis, realized that I wasn't an e-terrorist, well, they allowed me to web scrape their website on a few conditions. So those conditions are outlined here on the screen. And, a lot of these are very easy. They're pretty straightforward. I needed confirmation from the college that they support this request. Basically, that's a one sentence from your library director saying that they have your support. You needed to submit a brief summary, maybe a short paragraph on some of the outcomes and objectives. Again, easy enough. And then you have to specify a certain time frame. But the most difficult part of these requirements was setting up a dedicated IP address because we couldn't use the IP ranges that we would typically share with vendors. When we're setting up access to e-journals online, colleges would usually, share their IP ranges with that vendor. We couldn't use any of those IP addresses, and I couldn't use any single IP address that was used for any other purpose on campus. And what this really means, the root of the issue is IT had to create basically a computer for me, a virtual machine. It took them maybe a week to set up, and that IP address can only be used for this project. And then when I was finished with the project, I couldn't continue the web scraping anymore. And, what this really does evidence is that it demonstrates the value in having a strong connection with other staff members on the college campus. Because I couldn't really give this session a title, something like, Going It Alone, New Advances in Collection Development, because that wouldn't be technically true. I mean, of course, all of the code is mine. I created it in-house. The ideas were mine, they're original, but I couldn't get this far without IT setting up that IP address for me. And I couldn't get this far without, the vendor, Taylor and Francis, supporting my request. All right. And just one more last slide to kind of situate ourselves. Why exactly do we want to do this? Well, the art therapy program is historic. It started in 1997, and to this day, it's the only program available of its kind in the state of Connecticut. The graduating classes are small enough for librarians to connect individually with each student, which basically means, if we're able to gain insight into what art therapy subject experts themselves are citing, what keywords they're using, we could feed that information back to students if they're struggling to do things like choose a topic or publish research or, present at a conference. We could provide them with some of those ideas, some of the conversations other art therapy authors are having. And this project is built off of an earlier project where I performed text and data mining on art therapy theses to conduct something similar as citation analysis. So at the time, before this web scraping project, I was like, I want to see what art therapy students are using. Like, are they using library resources? What resources are they using? Because everyone knows that students typically lean on Google Scholar a little bit more than we would like them to do. So we try to encourage them to use library databases, but I was kind of curious on what resources these students were actually using. Now, this project with web scraping was also limited to journals either open access or subscribed through Taylor and Francis. So we couldn't, let's say, perform the same activity for nursing research because we didn't have any direct subscriptions to those journals. So that was a limiting factor. So selecting art therapy for this project was intentional. And we felt that it was, our strongest opportunity to reconnect with faculty was through this program itself. All right, so some of the nuts and bolts before showing the results. Essentially, the code I created needed six important elements to it. So we have to construct, using Python, around 350 to 400 links dynamically so that the web scraper can access each web page on its own. Theoretically, you could copy and paste each URL into the code, but then, you're inviting a lot of opportunity for human error, and you're also adding a lot of time for the code to execute. So the first step was to construct, using Python, a way to make these links dynamically so that the code would just automatically bring up the website on its own without any humans being involved. Then, when visiting the web page, the code needs to dismiss any banners, like those pesky cookie acknowledgement forms that pop up from the bottom of the screen. Well, the code has to dismiss those banners automatically because what that cookie acknowledgement banner was actually doing was it was masking a lot of the CSS and HTML until you dismiss it. So the web scraper would access the web page. It would click on the acknowledgement form on your behalf. And then, once the code removes the banner, it automatically scrolls to the bottom of the page to mimic human behavior. And so, you could code this aspect in to instruct the web scraper to take maybe 1 to 3 seconds to slowly scroll down the web page. And by the way, you can see this happen in real time. It's pretty cool to watch. And the reason for that is because we wanted to allow enough time for the website to fully load. So we wanted to make sure that those HTML and CSS elements were popping up on the screen. And, the code just wasn't executing too fast because, without adding in those pauses, you could web scrape 300, 400 websites in maybe a few seconds. Now, if the article did not have an abstract, then the code was instructed to skip that article. And the reason for that was, basically I found that articles published in art therapy, if they don't have an abstract, then those articles are mostly just reflection pieces, like they upload some really nice artwork, like a painting, or some other art artifact. And then there's like a short reflective piece written. And while that's really interesting, that's data I wasn't really interested in scraping. So if there's no abstract, the code is going to skip that article and then go to the next one. Then, it's going to extract all of the citations, the keywords, and abstracts into a list. And then it's going to pull all of that data into a CSV file for cleaning and visualizing. And, if you're thinking, oh, why didn't you also code a way for, to bring you to that Starbucks website and to have the web scraper order you a drink? Trust me, I thought about it. I'm still a little bit uncomfortable about using my credit card information, even if it's my own code that I'm using. Um, but, it's fair to say that I would be doing everyone here a disservice if I left out at least some Python basics in our gentle introduction. And actually, you've seen some of this already before in an earlier slide. And, I'm keeping to my promise of, having this be a very basic introduction. Because if there are three things you need to know about Python, what are the foundational building blocks? That's going to include variables, lists, and loops. And there are also other foundational pieces to Python, but these are the three important things that you need to know in order to understand how the web scraper works. And they're very straightforward, easy to understand. And so we see that a variable is really just a way to name things or to store data for later use. So our variable name, my grocery bag, and by the way, you could name variables anything you want in the world. There are some conventions you have to follow, but keeping to our example, we have a variable, my grocery bag, and this variable holds the text data item lentils. Keep in mind that if it's text data, well, we basically just have to wrap that using quotation marks, just like that. Now, lists can also be stored in variables. So we have the same variable, my grocery bag, and now that variable is holding a list of text items. So we see lentils, onions, potatoes. Also notice that each text item is separated by a comma. And again, it's text data, so it has to be wrapped in those quotation marks. That is just the Python syntax. And then ultimately everything, that list is wrapped in those square brackets. And finally, loops. Um, a loop is a way to perform a specific action on every item in a list. So let's say, all of those text items in my grocery bag, you want to perform a specific action on each of those items. Maybe you want to remove items that cost a certain amount of money. Maybe you want to capitalize the first letter of all of those text options. You do that using a loop. And if you're thinking, well, it's only three items, why don't I just manually do it myself? Technically, you can, but imagine a Python list that contains, 100 objects or 100 items or 1,000 or 10,000. Because they really do get that big. That is the purpose of a loop, to really automate most of that work for you. And so as a website is being scraped, items are being inserted into lists. And then each item is then cleaned and processed by using loops. So we're going to see that pretty soon. Hmm. So back to our I Spy image, we're capturing all the trophies from the source. And some loop logic might be, if the trophy has a person on the top, then perform a specific action on that item. Otherwise, perform another option or another action on that item. And, for those who love to look under the hood, this is what the Python code looks like for creating those dynamic URLs. We have, again, a list of DOIs of all art therapy articles published within the last 5 years. So that's 2021 to 2025 or 2020 to 2025. And then the loop logic is we want Python to take each individual DOI from the list, and then we want to append it to the stable URL. So if you have some background in library systems and collections, if you look at the linking option in your ILS, you might see something similar to this, where we're taking the stable part of the URL, something that's common to all of the art therapy journals, and then we're appending unique DOIs to every link. And then at the very end, we're taking each full link and then we're adding it into a new list for later use. And that fully constructed link is what the web scraper itself is going to use. Again, nothing too new here. On the left, we have our variables. Notice that I named them J references for journal references and B for books. And then I created some logic to calculate, how many references were actually scraped on the page. And you know, how does it really know? How does the code know how to do this? How does it know that the citation in the article is a journal or a book? Well, we see the argument passed here, references, numeric ordered list, journals, how that's being mapped directly to the HTML and CSS code on the website itself. So we're just really mapping the information. We're making sure everything aligns correctly, because the website code itself does most of the heavy lifting for us. We have to just figure out how this and where this information lives. So if we take the first line of the code, very basically, the code is literally saying, in this variable, journal references or J references, have the driver, which is the web scraper, find elements by the CSS selector or the CSS class, and then you have to pass in what specific class you want the web scraper or the driver to target. Hmm. Okay, and the results of all of this. So first, the good. The code was able to scrape from, around 230 to 250 articles, over 5,000 references. Now, most of these are going to be journals. That's not too surprising. And about 466 keywords. Then we have the ugly. I couldn't say the bad as well because there's really nothing bad in the code or bad that happened. But, there were some ugly things that happened, and most of the ugly things are pretty common to coders. It's all the post-processing work, like cleaning data. And so for the ugly, we had a fair amount of spelling or styling differences for the citations, and that made it hard to aggregate the content. For example, some references had extra punctuation after the title, and others had a different title altogether. So some authors, instead of saying art therapy, which is the journal title, they would use the older version, the Journal of the American Art Therapy Association. These are common things, and these are just things that have to be smoothed out manually before analysis can occur. Okay, so I really hope everyone here is a visual learner because it's a lot easier to visualize the outcome as opposed to listing all of the journals on the screen. And these are all of the journal titles that were captured, sized by citation frequency. So we have art therapy on the left-hand side, and the Canadian Journal of Art Therapy on the right-hand side. I'm just going to leave this slide up for about 5 seconds for people to take it all in. Obviously, what you could tell are really the heavy hitters. Art therapy, they tend to cite themselves a lot of the times, citing the same journal. The arts and psychotherapy is, probably the second or third more popular journal used in both publications. And then even the Canadian Journal of Art Therapy, we're seeing the same thing, where a lot of self-citations are occurring. Authors are citing the journal itself, or they're leaning on art therapy or the arts and psychotherapy. But having the data available that we web scraped, we could visualize how top-cited journals change from year to year. And we can, of course, see which journals have been cited 10 times or more in the table down below. Um, the next step involved mapping these journals to our holdings. And what we were able to determine was, at least for the journals, a majority of these titles were already in our collection. And doing that mapping between, from this table to our actual holdings did not require any code because, we set a threshold on how many citations were acceptable for us to check. And we determined, maybe 10 or 12 journals. We wanted to make sure we had those journals in our collection. And for the most part, we had basically all of them in, which is great. It's fantastic news. But we could do the same thing for books and ebooks as well. Now, this is an aggregated visualization, so it combines both art therapy and the Canadian Journal of Art Therapy as well. And what we could really tell from this visualization is that, the use of monographs are more equally spread out. Citations are more evenly distributed. Now, the top books, such as the Wiley Handbook of Art Therapy, actually was not in our collection. And, many of these other ebooks also were not in our collection. So now we have that argument to bring back to senior leadership, asking for, additional funds for our collections budget. And if you're thinking, well, it's only 15, 20 books, kind of what's the big deal? It's not that expensive. Trust me, I hear you, I understand. But the college had a $0 book budget. Yeah, it was quite challenging for us. And as I mentioned, we could do the same thing with keywords. The web scraper doesn't just extract citations, it could also pull out all of the keywords that the journals themselves have been using. So these are keywords from 2021 to 2022, and it really demonstrates how quickly social events enter the publication record. So we see a lot of references to the pandemic, to COVID, diversity, and social justice. These are the keywords from 2023 to 2025. And then all of the keywords aggregated together. But because not all articles had keywords and sometimes the keywords were not that descriptive, we wanted to take a look at the abstracts itself. Also, if you're trying to squint looking at this photo, first of all, I apologize, but I promise what's more important are the bigger words. So words like cultural humility, ones that really stand out because they're sized by frequency. And this is the abstract analysis, the result there. And frankly, this is where I probably could have made some improvements in the code because the abstracts were not giving us the information I really hope it would. I applied very basic natural language processing for each abstract. And, quite simply, this means treating each word as its own unit. So you take a paragraph and each word becomes an item in a Python list. And then you tag that item according to its role. So if it's a verb, an adjective, a noun, etc., And then you take that word and then you stem it to its root form. And I do have an example that will clarify all of this for us today. But only when words are processed like that can we aggregate all of this text together and find meaningful patterns. But even, to this extent, we do find some meaning here. We see some words really stand out, like community and social. Also, the word identity is somewhere in the margin here. Just a future improvement. But here's a very basic and fun example of how natural language processing works. So you could say, I need to eat better banana bread. I love banana bread. Who doesn't? Now, the word better in this context is used as an adjective. So the code converts the word better to the word good. Now we could take a look at a different sentence. We need to better our baking. In that context, excuse me, better is actually used as a verb. So it does not convert to good, it remains as the word better. And that's how the system knows to convert words to, combine them and aggregate them to find meaning in a huge corpus of text. All right, so we made it. And because I always like to end on a good note, something nice. Kudos to IT and the publisher for making this work possible. Albertus's collection for art therapy research is mostly aligned to recent research trends. That's amazing. Something interesting, I wasn't expecting that many self-citations where the journal Art Therapy really blew all the other journals out of the water. And you might be thinking, well, you know, why are you so surprised about that? Because, it's the specialized journal in art therapy. Of course, there's going to be a lot of citations there. The reason why I was so surprised is because the practice of art therapy, is really very interdisciplinary. So I was expecting, a lot more citations coming from sociology journals, psychology journals, maybe even political science. And it was something that I just wasn't seeing. Also, Taylor and Francis can probably do a better job choosing keywords for their articles. Out of curiosity, I checked the same articles in EBSCO. And EBSCO, they have much more descriptive keywords. So I don't know if authors themselves, when they're publishing in Taylor and Francis in those journals, are responsible for choosing keywords. That could certainly help explain why the keywords are a little bit weak, directly from the publisher. And something more, so a few next steps. As you know, I'm no longer at Albertus Magnus College, so it's totally up to my colleagues to determine where to take this from here. They could integrate keywords into information literacy instruction. They can conduct an article analysis on top journals, so looking at the journal titles and picking out, what words appear in titles themselves instead of abstracts and keywords. They could even expand the project to cover similar journals available in from other publishers like Arts and Psychotherapy and the International Journal of Art Therapy. And all right, so if you're interested in learning Python, and I hope you are, just as a curiosity, I do a lot of this stuff on the side as a hobby. And that proves two things. It proves that, you could really have any background and really latch onto this. It also demonstrates that I could probably benefit to have more friends and more of a social life. But in any case, if you're interested, um, definitely check out this book. I highly recommend it. Python Crash Course, the third edition. It has a lot of really fun projects. It takes things very slowly. Also, I highly recommend Udemy. Udemy, it has very affordable classes. Most of them are around $200, but at least twice a month, all of those prices come down to about, $10 to $20. And some other ideas, what you could do once you have a mastery or some awareness of Python. These are projects that I've completed in the last couple of years. We built our own sushi harvesting software. We created an interlibrary lending and borrowing map to showcase the importance of the work that librarians do to senior leadership. And we conducted some batch mark editing as well.